In the year 1789, widespread revolution came to France. Tension between the government, the bourgeoisie, and the peasant class boiled over. Louis XVI, the last monarch of France, was executed on January 21st, 1793, and the nation's feudal system died with him. Tens of thousands were killed as part of this political and social upheaval, irrevocably changing Western culture forever. Assassin's Creed Unity, released in 2014, is a video game about stabbing people and jumping off buildings. It's a series that has always flirted with the idea of political commentary, putting the player in a position to observe a very ugly side of history. But it uses that for flavor, to entice as wide an audience as it can, while adding nothing to the conversation itself beyond tepid centrism. Class disparity and social upheaval are also deeply relevant topics today. Imagery of the French Revolution is incredibly popular right now for some reason.
Ah! With their heads!
But Ubisoft wasn't interested in making political statements with Unity. French journalist Robin Andraca published an article about a French controversy related to Unity immediately following its worldwide launch. In Andraca's article, he quotes from the political blog of one Alexis Corbière, a prominent politician who currently serves in the actual modern National Assembly. Corbière decried Unity as, quote, reactionary propaganda, and for, quote, portraying the people of Paris as a brutal and bloodthirsty cohort. Corbière further denounced Unity for what he saw as a bestial caricature of Maximilien Robespierre. Now that we have over half a decade of space, was Corbière overreacting? Here's a clip that could possibly be your first introduction to Robespierre within the game.
And you can identify these citizens?
Many, yes. They are not loyal to France.
You truly are a gifted spy, Danton. Perhaps too gifted. Arrest this traitor.
You can't do this! No!
The cinematic language here is crystal clear. This guy is evil. But who was Robespierre for real? Is this depiction wrong? We'll circle back to him and other important historical figures later in the video. Interestingly, in Andraca's article, Corbière is quoted recognizing the medium of video games as an important cultural object, one that deserves to be scrutinized as such. Now, one of the game's producers has a response in this same article. Antoine Vimal du Montiel is quoted as saying, Assassin's Creed Unity is a mainstream video game, not a history lesson. And there you have it. Unity would rather you not consider this a history lesson. Good to know. This video will focus on how Unity chose to represent historical events and historical figures, primarily in the scripting, things like the dialogue, the actions characters take, and the themes at play. In addition, I'll examine how fictional characters within the game contribute to this narrative, and what the narrative seems to be saying about the time period. And my background is in acting, writing, and film, so there are certain facets to Unity that I simply don't have much to say about, like the veracity of its frankly amazing architecture design. As far as I can tell, this stuff is all great, but I'm not an architect, even a little bit. Also, while there's a lot of stuff I could say about the gameplay of Unity, I could go really in depth, but doing that would completely dilute the purpose of this video. Incredibly, while doing my research, I stumbled upon someone whose dissertation was focused on contrasting Assassin's Creed Unity with two other historical texts. Kylie Malkin-Page wrote an incredibly detailed and useful document about this subject. I'll be referencing this excellent work of hers throughout. Malkin-Page concludes convincingly and passionately that video games are a valuable medium for education. And despite some reservations about Unity's biases, she is also impressed with the way the game allows players to experience aspects of history firsthand, and how it encourages players, with varying degrees of success, to consider alternative perspectives. I'd also give Unity some measure of credit for this, but not out of kindness. Unity inspired my research because of how cartoonishly one-dimensional its historical figures were portrayed, and I wanted to see how actual history regarded the revolution. There's one other thing I should go over before we begin, and it involves video games as a medium. You see, video games are a unique medium. They exist as a blend of cinema, novel, comic, and direct player interaction with all of the above. This synthesis creates something entirely its own. But by virtue of blending all these mediums, video games end up with many different ways to receive their text, and some are naturally emphasized or de-emphasized by how they're presented to the player. Many video games contain layers upon layers of texts and types of texts buried within, often called a codex or something like that. These menus will bury hundreds or thousands of pages of extra text inside a menu for those who really love reading. But it's more than that, because these pages are often a hassle to engage with at all. They'll be buried in an out-of-the-way place that's incredibly easy to ignore in perpetuity. Or they'll jam the text into a little tiny corner where it becomes a huge pain in the butt to read any of it at all. What I'm driving at is that some of the text of a video game is really obvious, front and center, impossible to miss. Other text is buried within archives, inside menus, locked behind context events. Some text is trivially easy to ignore or miss out on. It's like the Hagrid is gay or whatever exists out in the Pottermore wiki or something for really dedicated fans, but doesn't have any place within the main narratives of the books or movies. It's fluff. It hints at some additional depth, or in Pottermore's case, representation, that isn't really there. What happens in a critical reading of these texts is that a critic will draw attention to something that's missing, or some sort of problem, and a fan will counter by pointing to these obscure chunks of text from an archive or a wiki that you really had to go out of your way to even know about, but will also act like these things fundamentally alter the reading of the entire text. They don't. Unity deals in real history, but this information is obfuscated in three key ways. The first is the codex, as I mentioned before. The second is that we don't know when real history has been fudged intentionally for the sake of fiction. The third and final reason is the mission structure. Arno's main sequence is what's labeled as plot mandatory content. This is the chronological story of the protagonist that everyone will be guided down. These events are fairly straightforward to follow, too. But much of the game's historical content is loaded into the optional co-op missions. These missions always start the same way. An omnipresent voice from real life monologues a bit to set the historical scene.
Paris, 1794. Every day is execution day. George Danton, hero of the revolution, and he's headed to the guillotine.
The cinematic language here tells us she is correct, which means we're not intended to question anything she's saying. Troublingly, some of this information is blatantly fictionalized. Further, the stories are almost always randomly shuffled between events through 1789 all the way to 1794. No care is paid to chronological order. One of the first missions you can do in these co-op missions is in 1793, and at the time you're going to be doing that in the story, you're still in 1790. What all this means is that Unity's methodology for imparting information to the player is skewed. And it is for this reason that my analysis is of what I believe to be Unity's main text, and an attempt to understand why they might have made the decisions they did. I want to look at the main story and how some of the co-op missions are presented, because if you interact with Unity the way the vast majority of players do, you will see no nuance in most of the historical figures they choose to include. Video games do deserve our respect as tools of education. Video games also deserve our scorn when they're used as lazy propaganda or shameless tools to extract more money from their audiences. And a discerning eye toward which parts they're saying out loud and which parts they're saying really quiet can do a lot to tell us what they're really interested in getting across. The story of Unity follows the perspective of Arno Dorian, a child of the bourgeoisie who is orphaned at a young age by the villainous protagonist of a different Assassin's Creed game.
The American Revolution undid your Templar business.
Then perhaps I make my own luck, Liam.
After being orphaned, Arno is taken in by another member of the wealthy upper class, one Francois de la Serre. De la Serre's daughter, Elise, is the main supporting character in Arno's story, and, awkwardly, both his adoptive sister and primary love interest. Ugh. I don't know why they added this dubiously close to incest angle for this romantic subplot, but if you ignore the odd upbringing, like the game itself certainly does, the romance between these two is fairly charmingly portrayed. Again, just ignore that bit about them being siblings. Ugh. All three of these main characters in the early game, Arno, Elise, and Francois, are fictional, so they're not part of actual French history, but instead serve to set up some interesting class dynamics in the early part of the story, as well as establish what the setting is like for our characters and what perspective we'll be following through history. Arno, despite a privileged early childhood, has grown up to be a charming young scoundrel, but he's also looked down upon by others in high society. Elise and her father could be seen to represent different facets of the wealthy class in France. Now, they're both portrayed sympathetically, but to varying degrees, and Francois' staff is generally very rude to Arno, clearly telegraphing that our character is no longer part of high society. He's only adjacent to it. This all does a fantastic job of setting the mood, as well as giving us a peek at class dynamics to come, or at least class dynamics that should be coming. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Arno is framed for the murder of his adoptive father, and he's thrown in jail. He meets a grumpy mentor figure who tells him to join the Assassins, which, it should be stated, is such a bizarre name for your underground resistance movement. Like, I kind of got used to it after playing a bunch of these games, but doing an analysis where I'm considering actual history really highlights just how goofy it is that these guys are still calling themselves the Assassins. On the plus side, Arno reacts to this with a healthy amount of skepticism, at least at first.
Listen, I'm sure your little cult is a delightful bunch, but I'm not interested.
Once Arno gets out of jail with the help of his new adoptive dad, the first thing he does is go to see Elise. She rejects him because his irresponsibility got her dad killed.
I didn't know.
Neither did my father.
Arno is left with nothing, and it's for a lack of direction that he decides to go join the Assassins. Arno's already got 2 dead dads. How bad can it be? It's at this point the game world opens up, which is a fascinating creative choice. As Arno, you're still wearing the dirty old clothes you were arrested in, you have no support, no friends, and can ostensibly do whatever you want now. Except, like Arno, you have no direction until you join the Assassins. This is really neat, and I love the way gameplay and story sync up here, but it's only for a fleeting moment. And it would work much better if you couldn't randomly walk into full-on side quests that seem to assume you're a bit further on, like how you can join an actual cult for reasons I never really figured out. Arno has been chewed up and spit out by a system that only has contempt for him as a poor person. He has no purpose now, so he joins a radical underground reform group that occasionally advocates for the need for violence to truly change systems of power. No politics here, by the way. Arno joins because he's lost and wants a purpose again, to avenge his dead dads. He doesn't have any broader interest in the Assassin's ideals yet, and this is a common theme in the whole Assassin's Creed series. The protagonist, suffering personal consequences, joins an order which strives for the greater good. By joining, they eventually learn how to not only better themselves, but to work for causes beyond themselves. It's a good formula, and up to here, Arno follows it to the letter. This isn't a problem, either. It's a great way to set him up to grow past his own guilt, forgive himself for his mistakes, and find new purpose as someone working for goals beyond his own. As part of joining the Assassin Brotherhood, Arno enters a dream sequence where he defeats himself. or more specifically, a metaphorical representation of himself, his personal guilt and self-loathing. The game's not wasting any time on these themes. The whole opening up to this point and Arno's joining does excellent work setting up really compelling class dynamics, and as well as a dramatic take on them that can help illuminate issues present at the time. It's also done great work establishing who Arno is, what his character flaws are, and hinted at how he may develop over the rest of the story. I love this opening. It's absolutely brimming with potential. But here's the rub. The game squanders all of it. The game started Arno's adult story in 1789, and after Arno joins the subterranean murder squad, a whole year passes, wherein he becomes an assassin off-camera and the year advances to 1790. But not only does this skip over the entire context for Arno's training as an assassin, it also skips the rest of an extremely influential year in history. We lose sight of who Arno has become through a full year of training with the Assassin Brotherhood. We lose sight of context for the French Revolution itself, and clarity never really comes back for either. This means that even though interesting things do happen to Arno, we barely understand how he feels about them. We barely understand how they relate to his character arc, nor do we even grasp what it means for the history surrounding the story. We never even find out how Arno feels about killing people, which should be a huge central part of the plot, considering one of the game's biggest themes is, when is violence in the name of politics acceptable? To illustrate a problem that I'm talking about with the history in this game, prior to Arno becoming an assassin, one mission has him sneaking through the Estates General. As your typically poorly educated American, I had no idea what this was before doing the research for this video. And here's a brief overview in case you don't know either. Amid political tension escalating dramatically in 1789, the King of France agreed to convene the Estates General on May 5th, 1789. This was a meeting between the clergy, the nobility, and the representatives of the majority population that had last met in 1614. That's 175 years prior, and meetings between these three parties were often hamstrung by conflicting interests. That group responsible for representing the masses, the Third Estate, was apparently often undermined by their members' tendencies to become part of the nobility, which then shifted their interests accordingly. But this time, in 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate were worried about being muscled out, and over the next couple months created the Revolutionary National Assembly, which signaled the end of representation via traditional social classes. Arno explicitly does not care about this event when it's happening, which means the player is similarly being signaled to not care. The whole framing is with Arno, so the average player who's not already invested in the history will follow suit with their protagonist and ignore the events entirely. This is the only historical event from the entire year of 1789 that's depicted as part of the main text of Assassin's Creed Unity. To give an extremely basic overview of what was happening at the time, here's just some historical context for what caused the French Revolution in 1789. Quote, "The bourgeoisie resented exclusion from political power. The peasants were less willing to support the burdensome feudal system. The philosophies were read widely in France. French participation in the American Revolution drove the government to the brink of bankruptcy. France was populous, and crop failures in 1788 compounded with fraught economic hardships. And finally, the French monarchy was unable to adapt to modern politics." This stuff seems like a pretty big deal, right? But none of it comes back to reflect on Arno as a character. Past joining the Assassins, Arno basically stops developing in the context of the French Revolution, or even in the context of his own plotline. When Arno assassinated the concept of himself, he really assassinated the concept of his character development. Arno is shown to value loyalty to the Brotherhood, even when that forces him into a lethal duel against his latest dad.
That's a pity.
Arno is shown to be reckless, and that eventually gets him kicked out of the Assassin's Order entirely.
Your rank and title are stripped from you, and you are hereby exiled from the Brotherhood of Paris.
Arno is shown to be in love with a woman consumed by vengeance, and her desire for vengeance above all else gets her killed at the end of the story.
I'm sorry.
Elise!
None of this stuff really has a payoff. Oh, also, Arno is shown to have the power to Vulcan mind meld with people he's just assassinated, and this never goes anywhere. This isn't like a storytelling metaphorical flourish or anything either. He literally tells people in the story that he can do this.
In his memories, I saw him writing the letter that would have warned Monsieur de la Serre of his betrayal.
Despite all this interesting stuff, none of it really goes anywhere. Arno's story ends with him exactly where he started when he first escaped prison. He's alone, no family, no friends, no assassins. This downer ending could be really interesting. It's really novel and unique for this series to have an ending where the protagonist is so disempowered like this. But even this is undercut. In a very boring post-credits scene, Arno is shown to be a master assassin sometime later in life, working with Napoleon to do something. This is probably sequel bait, and it got canned when the game was lambasted for launching unfinished. I assume that's why they kind of cut and run instead of making a Unity trilogy or an Arno trilogy like they did with Ezio before. But it means that even as a standalone story with a tragic ending, it doesn't have any bite. We know he's going to be welcomed back into the Order sometime later in life, but we never see how or why. This is all to say, I really loved what they set up with Arno, but
I haven't changed that much, Elise.
honestly, despite my discontent with Arno's character arc, there's still a lot of good stuff here. And I adored Shay in Assassin's Creed Rogue for his character potential in a lot of ways, so I totally understand anybody who thinks Arno is rad. But if Arno's character arc is subjective, why bring it up at all? I want to know what we can extract from Arno's character arc in an analysis of Unity's overall themes, and how those themes tie into Ubisoft's choices representing historical events. Arno has a speech at the end of the game where he warns against dogma, and essentially preaches a level-headed and cautious approach to events. Arno's recklessness, which they did establish earlier in the game, is meant to be read as political dogma, but I don't think they sufficiently tie these together in the game. Arno is rarely working toward a clear political objective when he's being reckless. Instead, he spends most of the plot avenging the second of his 3 dead dads. If Unity's message were a strong condemnation of all political violence, that's at least a message I could understand. I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, because punching Nazis is good. But condemnation of violence is decidedly not the text of Unity, either. Spending 30-odd hours shanking political rivals in the back makes sure we know that violence is actually radical. So what is Unity trying to say? Simply, Unity is trying to present an apolitical view of the French Revolution. Now, this article is about a different, more recent Ubisoft game, but I believe this speaks to their corporate culture. Per the article I just showed on the screen, lead developer of Ghost Recon Breakpoint, Sebastian Leprester, tells GameSpot, quote, "We're creating a game here. We're not trying to make political statements in our games. We've rooted ourselves in reality, and you'll get what you get out of your playthrough. The story might make you see different situations, but we're not trying to guide anybody or to make any sort of statements." End quote. Unfortunately for Ubisoft, trying not to make a political statement is making a political statement, and one that hurts Unity's credibility as a period piece. The ways they've fudged history are an attempt to sanitize the curriculum. Let's start with Unity's depiction of Théroigne de Méricourt. Content warning. Théroigne de Méricourt's life involves discussion of violence against women. Skip to the time in the video marked below if you would rather proceed to the next discussion. Théroigne de Méricourt was a notable figure in the history of women's rights. She argued for women's rights all through the Revolution, advocating for women's place as citizens equal to men, and that women should be permitted to bear arms in the defense of France. Her activism painted a target on her back, and the Parisian royal press began to portray her as the, quote, patriot's whore, and as a, quote, female war chief. These kinds of attacks on her character are certainly childish, but one interesting thing is that some of the rumors printed to be negative at the time are things we broadly see as positive today. One of these rumors is prominently in Unity as well, the idea that Méricourt was an important player in the Women's March on Versailles. Apparently, Méricourt herself denied being present. From my research, it appears to be contested as to whether or not she was actually there, but the majority opinion appears to be that she wasn't. Now, you can take this all with a grain of salt, but Unity presents it as a clear fact, when it's anything but. This raises an interesting question, because the way Méricourt has been bolstered by the fiction here appears to be a positive thing, right? It's in service to presenting a woman who worked for women's rights in a positive light. Being pro-feminism is objectively good, and Unity appears to be saying so as well. But there's a problem, and here's where the violence warning from earlier comes in. On May 15th, 1793, Méricourt was violently attacked by female supporters of the Jacobins, where she was stripped naked and beaten to within an inch of her life. Méricourt was rescued by Jean-Paul Marat, a political theorist, radical journalist, and an icon to the Jacobins themselves. Unity, however, rewrites the history of this moment in a couple crucial ways. They sanitize how this violence occurred by removing the bit where they stripped her naked, which is fine because depicting that would be a lot. But they also change the perpetrator. Instead of a mob of women, as it was in real life, Unity presents us a single angry man with a whip. They also don't show how she was rescued. So this scene much more clearly evokes abuse of women by men, an image we've thankfully come to accept in society as repulsive. But this is a departure from reality, where other women attacked Méricourt. And I imagine Ubisoft believed that to depict other women attacking Méricourt might confuse the issue. So instead, they created a depiction which leaves no room for doubt. This guy, and his ideals, are evil. Now, this is not to defend the people who beat Méricourt in real life, but the real-life version of this event includes Méricourt being saved by someone who held many of those same ideals. This real-life version of the event muddies the waters and makes it harder to pick a side, because real-life events are very complex, and Unity, for its changes, deftly vilifies the Jacobins. And the final change in this event from real life is what happened to Méricourt as a result. In real life, Méricourt left politics after this attack. Méricourt went on to be certified insane and institutionalized in September 1794, which is a lot. But in Unity, Méricourt just keeps going instead, and she leads the players on a revenge-style assault on what remains of the Jacobin party, where you hunt down and murder these evil woman-beating Jacobins with the same nuance video games might give a quest to clear out a den full of goblins or something. This has two consequences. One, Méricourt's real-life story is far more tragic and points to more systemic issues of sexism than the Unity version. I'd recommend looking into her story if you want an interesting and tragic look at the life of a woman who took many political steps trying to make life better for women, and was ultimately removed from her political position violently for it. And that second consequence is that Méricourt's life story has been co-opted to make the Jacobins look universally evil. So we're finally here. Who were the Jacobins, and who are they now? I'll cut to the chase. The Jacobins were radical leftists. Now, unlike modern leftist movements, which have no infighting whatsoever, the Jacobin Club was subject to intense infighting. When the Jacobin Club split in July of 1791, Maximilien Robespierre took up leadership. Robespierre was in charge when, in the summer of 1793, the Reign of Terror kicked off, and the Jacobins played a key part in what was ultimately a wave of executions aimed at enemies of the revolution: nobles, priests, hoarders. The Reign of Terror is the most infamous part of the French Revolution, a time period between 1793 and 1794 in which an estimated 300,000 people were arrested, and a further estimated 27,000 died. Of those estimated 27,000, 17,000 are believed to have been executed, and 10,000 more died without trial or just in jail. It was the most violent period of the revolution. Was this a good thing? Probably not entirely. Even if you do believe massive societal upheaval was a necessary rebuttal to centuries of structural violence against the poor, spoilers, I do, it's hard to imagine that all 17,000 need to have been guillotined to bring about the change they wanted. 10,000 people dying in prison without trial also undeniably sucks. Few episodes have been as horrible, but few have done more to improve the everyday lives of ordinary men and women. But what of the man in charge of the moment, Maximilien Robespierre himself? Robespierre is presented by Assassin's Creed Unity as a conniving, ruthless, awful man who used the moment in an attempt to grab political power for himself. Unity's Robespierre would turn on everyone in an attempt to make himself leader of France, and to do that, he's going to work with Templars to intentionally agitate toward revolution. Robespierre is one of only a handful of historical figures that Arno interacts with in the main sequence, along with Napoleon and Mirabeau, but Robespierre is by far the one with the most screen time. Robespierre in real life is a far more complex political figure. He's said to have been altruistic in his early career as a lawyer and judge, taking cases for the poor and minorities which alarmed the privileged. Once Robespierre joined the National Assembly, he worked toward many progressive ideals. He opposed religious and racial discrimination, fought for universal suffrage, and overall fought passionately for liberty in France. During the Reign of Terror itself, Robespierre objected to those who took advantage of food shortages, and promised a maximum price for all foodstuffs. Robespierre also objected to pointless executions. Robespierre stood for many ideals that we still hold dear to this day, pillars of society we take for granted now. None of this is to say that Robespierre is beyond critique. He did lead many, many executions against political rivals, including George Danton. Okay, let's talk about George Danton a bit. Danton was apparently a mountain of a man involved in the revolution. After the overthrow of the monarchy, Danton became part of the new Legislative Assembly. Danton is said to have dominated his colleagues there through strength of character, like in his most famous speech, where he is quoted as saying, quote, "To conquer the enemies of the fatherland, we need daring, more daring, daring now and always, and France is saved!" But his behavior did not always measure up to that. Infamously, Danton was unable to account for 200,000 livres of secret expenditures from a post he held in 1792. I had trouble finding an exact conversion for what this was worth today, but the ballpark for a good house at the time was somewhere around 4,000 livres. By modern standards, This is running off with millions of dollars in unaccounted for taxpayer money while people were starving. Good thing there are no examples of political figures who act like this today. Danton undeniably also played a key role in the revolution. He was effectively in charge of the government for a few months, starting in April 1793. After taking charge, Danton tried repeatedly to achieve diplomacy with the other side. However, only 3 months later, the committee Danton presided over was reformed without him. Danton's legacy is disputed. He possessed excessive wealth and was seen by his peers as venal. It's also generally accepted that he was used as an informant by the courts. However, he was well regarded as a leader of men that bridged the ideological divide between the wealthy and the poor, which was an important part of making changes happen. So how is Danton portrayed in Unity? Well,
George Danton, hero of the revolution, and he's headed to the guillotine. Danton's real crime was pissing off this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, father of the Terror.
in the most absurd historical twist that Assassin's Creed Unity does with Danton, in the game, he willingly lets himself be guillotined to discredit Robespierre. The idea that anyone would refuse Revolution-era Spider-Man's rescue and intentionally go to the guillotine just to discredit a political rival is absolutely ridiculous. This is such a farcical retelling of history that there should be an asterisk by Danton's head when he talks. Now, Danton did, actually, for real, tell the executioner, "Show my head to the people. It is worth the trouble." Which is metal as hell. Robespierre and Danton are both figures worthy of critique and examination, but both also pushed society forward in undeniable ways. Neither legacy is as simple as one good, one bad. Portraying them as such is a disservice to French history, and brings me to my ultimate conclusion. The problem with Assassin's Creed is that it so clearly wants to divide conflicts into a two-sided war between assassins and Templars, where the two correlate roughly to good and evil. It doesn't want you to think deeper about the themes at play, even though the real nuance of the French Revolution is that there were far more than just two sides, and what each of these many sides contributed is not neatly organized. What Unity gives us instead is a binary list of judgments, where the bad people are Templars and the good people are assassins. They do try to make this more complex with their fictional characters. That's one of the reasons I spent so much time talking about Arno and his 3 dead dads. But the storytelling nuance isn't used to say anything about the time period, nor does it extend to those real-life historical figures. The way these figures and events are portrayed today is in service to an agenda. Always. This is true of history books, of Assassin's Creed Unity, and yes, of me, too. Historical figures are used as symbols, and how we examine those symbols reflects what we want others to believe. When Unity chooses to vilify Robespierre and the Jacobins, it's conveniently also vilifying the symbols most easily associated with the modern left. When they make a hero out of Danton, it's conveniently a figure most easily associated with modern centrism. Danton died trying to work things out with everybody and return to a sense of normal. One more specific example. Early in the game, Unity tells us that there are these random goons throughout the streets who shake people down and kill them for little or no reason. There's a text pop-up, once, that claims these guys are paid off by the Templars to agitate. It's just this text pop-up. Otherwise, these guys are essentially revolutionaries. And all game long, you see these faux revolution guys screaming about royalists while murdering and pillaging. You're rewarded with fancy in-game goods for killing a bunch of them. Combined with this line from the protagonist of Assassin's Creed Rogue,
I make my own luck, Liam.
No, the actual line.
Then perhaps we shall start a revolution of our own.
It's strongly implied the entire revolution was kicked off by Templar agitation. I can't help but read this with the following subtext. The French Revolution was bad and violent. If only the evil, greedy, rich leftists hadn't tried to jockey for political power, maybe all this death was avoidable. But at the same time, the game advocates for political violence constantly, with Arno killing political rivals to advance his objectives all the time. Is my take needlessly pessimistic? Probably. The truth is that Unity's intended message is nothing, not a history lesson. They're hoping to say as little as possible. This is why I talked about Arno as well, because even in his story we see this pattern. They don't want to say anything risky in how the character might develop. Despite the very creative people working on the Assassin's Creed games in the creative departments, the people in charge of Ubisoft would be much happier if we didn't think about their games at all after consuming them like cheap, unremarkable fast food. The Assassin's Creed games have been some of my favorites for a long time, and the research necessary for this video gave me a whole new dimension through which to appreciate what the creative teams do pull off. But I'd be remiss not to mention that my grievances with Ubisoft go beyond their cowardly corporate practices. The sexual misconduct allegations against the company are very serious, and I don't think that their response has been sufficient. I'd be lying if I tried to say that doesn't make it easier for me to call them cowards. With Unity set in the French Revolution, it's alluding to modern democracy in some incredibly important ways, especially in 2021. And when Ubisoft's corporate agenda appears to be evoke history for clout while attempting to say nothing, well, they've said something pretty terrible, haven't they? Thanks for watching. Hey, welcome to the Epilogue. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. The amount of work that went into making this was massive, especially compared to the other two videos I've made before this. I don't doubt I've overlooked a lot of other interesting comparison points, and I wouldn't be surprised if my historical summaries have professionals somewhere strapping on their own hidden blades. But if I've sparked your interest in history, made you reconsider Assassin's Creed's purported neutrality, or even just entertained you for 40-some minutes, then I'm really happy. If you liked this, I'd love to hear from you. And hey, if you didn't like this, I'd still be happy to hear from you. Let me know what you think. If you feel like helping me out, the YouTube buttons like subscribe, comment, that stuff. They really go a long way for a new creator like me. Thank you so much for your time, and take care out there.
I thought I might take a stroll in the gardens with a friend.
A friend, is it? A true friend would not urge you to shirk your duties and risk unemployment.
I suppose not.
No, indeed. On your way, then.